Thanks, Barry. Before I introduce our final pre-lunch keynote speaker, I just want to second something that Barry had said and something I've been noticing. Each of these panels has multiple columns in them, for me anyway. I'm a heat-seeking missile for 800 words. But I encourage you to go back and really dive into these at your own leisure, because this is the kind of conference and the kind of conversation that people are going to be talking about, I think, for some time. So with that, let me introduce, last but not least before lunch, the keynote speaker, Ayad Akhtar. And I'm really honored to be able to do this. Ayad is the president of PEN America. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning dramatist, and he's the author of Homeland Eulogies, which tells the story of an immigrant family that has come to what they think of as a land of opportunity and has ended up in an America which has been strip-mined by monopolists. And I can relate to this story, actually, because I feel sometimes that Ayad and I came from the same family. My father, actually, both my parents are immigrants, but my father was a Turkish immigrant who came to work in the engineering field, and in particular in the auto components industry in rural Indiana in the 1970s. And during my childhood, we witnessed the consolidation of agriculture, which wiped out entire communities. We witnessed the strip mining by private equity, the outsourcing of large parts of the industrial commons. And I think that that's one of the main reasons why my home county, Clinton County, went 76% Trump. So I think that these conversations about class, about race, about economic justice, and about what kind of society we want to be are absolutely connected. And I can't think of anyone better to take us from Bork to Rome and beyond than Ayad. So with that, welcome.
Thank you, Rana. And it's an honor to be here, so thank you for inviting me, and thanks, Barry. I was... There'll be a bit of an Italian theme that I'm going to pick up here inadvertently. I didn't know that was going to be going on today. I was both surprised and delighted when Barry reached out to me after reading my 2020 novel, Homeland Elegies. It's not common for a literary work to contain a lengthy excursus about antitrust jurisprudence, but Homeland Elegies does. In addition to lengthy anatomies of an international financial industry fixated on fixed income and the debt processes that entails, and also on our country's healthcare system for profit, with shareholders of publicly traded companies being conceived of as stakeholders of greater importance than patients themselves. My book was an attempt to explore the complex affliction that has transformed our nation and which now seems to threaten its very reason for being, philosophically speaking. For little over more than a half decade, it's been clear something is amiss in our republic, but the recent political shocks we are all familiar with have their origin, I believe, in a half-century of neglect. As a famous Chinese proverb puts it, in a house where the son kills the father, the causes do not lie between the morning and the evening of a single day. The narrator of my book, Homeland Elegies, is the son of Pakistani immigrants. His parents came to this country lured by the promise of our nation's great mid-20th century prosperity and opportunity, and both seem to have a distinct feeling that they came to one country, and over time it became another. The narrator is on the search to understand this gap. Perhaps his immigrant parents never really understood America. Perhaps they underestimated the depth of American enamorment with individual wealth, an American passion perhaps more fundamental than any real commitment to civic health. Or perhaps something had fundamentally changed about this country and its ideals between when they arrived and when they came to end their lives in the New World 50 years later. Late in the novel, the narrator encounters an only thinly fictionalized character named Mike Jacobs, a prominent Black agent in Hollywood. The year is 2015. Over dinner at Red Rooster in Harlem, where Bill Clinton had passed through earlier that day, hosted in a private room for lunch by a group of hedge fund owners, Mike lays out a nuanced anatomy of the national mood, Having grown up in Alabama, living now on both coasts, Mike sees the plight of this country through both the urban and rural lenses, as well as understanding the enormous breach that's opened up between those in the heartland and those on the coasts. But first, he tells a story about his father, Jerry Jacobs, a lawyer who early in his career had clerked for Spotswood Robinson at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals when Robert Bork was on the bench there. What Mike's father would see from his front row seat was Bork's real legacy in action, not as a failed Supreme Court justice or as a cultural critic who sniffed decadence in Dixie music and detective novels, but as an antitrust ideologue who believed that the only meaningful check on corporate power should be the competitive threat of other corporations and that the consumer's benefit should be the only metric to gauge whether or not the government had cause to intervene. Over dinner, Mike explained to me that what his father had come to understand about America during his clerkship in such close proximity to Bork at the height of the Reagan years was essential. Even back in the mid-1980s, the city's political culture was still one of gentlemanly exchange. Partisan arguments before the bench or on the Senate floor were put aside when it was time for martinis and oysters at Occidental or Old Ebbitt Grill. It was at a similarly collegial evening in Georgetown that Bork found himself seated next to the young black lawyer he recognized from Justice Robinson's team. The two men launched into a lively conversation. Mike said that his father discovered in Bork that night someone far more personable than he'd expected given the man's haughty demeanor from the bench. Bork introduced Jerry to someone at the White House. A pair of subsequent lunches led to brief audience with the Gipper himself. Though it was never made explicit, Jerry gathered there was a need for black faces to support the administration's deregulatory initiatives. In particular, black businesses across the country were starting to organize against Reagan's new antitrust policies. It was an era of easy money. Mergers and takeovers were all the rage. Large and ever larger companies were swallowing up market share, putting smaller businesses to pasture, offering the promise of lower prices to compensate for the havoc wreaked on American main streets. At an earlier time in the nation's history, the federal government, of course, would have never allowed the naked corporate grab then underway in the late 1960s. Even a potential 8% market share was cause for the courts to block the merger of two grocery store chains in Los Angeles. 8%. Walmart now has 60% of grocery store market share in many markets. The judges explicitly sided with those who stood to lose their jobs and their businesses, even if the grocery merger might mean lower prices for consumers. Of course, Bork would change that. By 1977, he would publish The Antitrust Paradox, a book responsible for entirely framing our ideas about corporate competition and the benefit to the consumer, a book described as the most cited work on its subject in American history. By the time he published that book, much of his thinking was already bearing fruit. In Bork's years before the D.C. Circuit, teaching at Yale Law School and working in the Justice Department under Nixon, he had educated and promoted a generation of disciples who shaped opinion from the bench on the nation's business pages and in its boardrooms. Increasingly, the benefit to the consumer would become the dominant metric of the common good, and that benefit to the consumer would be defined by the lowest price. A company's scale no longer signified potential abuse of power. Only opportunity, for the bigger you were, the more power you had over your suppliers and employers, greater latitude to cut costs with impunity meant passing on those savings to the consumer. The consolidation began in grocery stores and other retail, would later expand to banks and insurers, railroads, trucking, airlines. Decades later, of course, this process would culminate in the rise of companies of almost godlike proportion, merchants of human attention and data whose digital technologies now command our very cognitive activity itself, even as we speak right now in this room. Concussive scale, market share, shirked responsibility to communities and workers, all of this has been permitted, no, encouraged, because of a so-called benefit to the consumer. But to hear Mike tell it, in the 1980s, black intellectuals and businessmen were already wondering whether the nation could really thrive through buying alone. Is that all we were as Americans, consumers? Certainly we were also laborers and owners and perhaps even citizens as well. Was there really no need to protect any of these aspects of our social being? Did the nation's welfare truly amount to little more than saving money at the cash register? If you were black in the 1980s, Mike explained, you couldn't ignore what the new laws really meant. Black banks, black insurers were getting bought up by white-owned holding companies, which were turning their backs on their new black customers. These growing conglomerates were not locally owned, had no local stakes, no incentives to attend to the needs of communities they didn't live in, didn't understand, and frankly didn't like. And connected to all this not so thinly veiled commercial racism was something people like Justice Spotswood Robinson couldn't forget, that their civil rights battles had owed more to black-owned business than most would ever understand. Economic independence was essential to the battle for full rights. The money to sustain the struggle had to come from somewhere. Most often it came from local black businesses. In the series of meetings that Mike's father took with members of various federal agencies and lobbying firms, he started to get a better picture of why they wanted him. Scarred by their defeats in the civil rights era, convinced beyond any doubt of the transformative force of organized black protest, Reagan Republicans were taking no chances. Recruiting black lawyers to serve in the cause of deregulation had become a top priority, and Bork, according to Mike, had identified Mike's father as a candidate. Jerry Jacobs would be offered a job at the Federal Trade Commission in 1986, but by then, having flirted with the Reaganites for more than a year, he'd figured out what they were up to. He would leave Washington and return home to Opelika, Alabama, where he would eventually be elected to the Alabama state legislature. But Mike would come to see his father's decision to leave the nation's capital and come home to Alabama as marred by sentimentality. It was all well and good to want to do right by those you loved. But as Mike saw it, you better have a real idea of what that might actually entail. Though his father had seen what was happening in America, Mike wasn't sure he understood just how little a person could do about it from a law office on Main Street or even from the State House in Montgomery. The new political order was mercantile at root, shaped and paid for by cash from the coffers of bigger and bigger business. And what this political order was doing to black businesses, it was actually doing to everyone. Chains and conglomerates weren't shuttering more black concerns than they were white ones. The mistake his father made, Mike started to understand, was to see all this solely through the lens of race. Locality itself was in decline. As dollars were drained from the American heartlands and allocated to points of prosperity offshore and along the coasts. In the South, it was in farming that you saw the worst of it. People, black, white, or brown, couldn't live off their land anymore. Corporate consolidation led to larger and larger tracts and increasingly automated systems required to water and harvest them. Prices for produce dropped, yes, but so did the tax base. There'd never been more jobs that paid so little, most of which went to migrants who didn't object to making a pittance. Towns were poor, which meant that schools were poorer too. Public education started to crumble, so did the roads and bridges. There were fewer landowners giving less money to an ever-dwindling number of churches and charities. Everywhere you went, people poured into big box stores to spend less on things they had less money to buy. The quarter-century slope of opportunity and morale in places like Opelika and Wichita and Grand Rapids and Scranton and just about everywhere across Middle America defined a descent from which increasingly there appeared to be little recourse. Suicide was on the rise, so were drugs, depression, and anger. And all this was before the financial crisis. Mike saw a country where people were poor, where they were lied to, where their lives felt meaner, where they had no idea how to change any of it. They'd taken the unprecedented step of putting a black intellectual into the highest office in the land, a man who promised change but offered little, whose admittedly genuine concern was marred by superciliousness, who gloried in his pop culture status while bemoaning a system whose political dysfunctions prevented him from leading. Obama's victory had turned out to be little more than symbolic, only hastening our nation's long collapse into corporate autocracy, and his failures had raised the stakes immeasurably. Most Americans couldn't cobble together a week's expenses in case of an emergency. The national mood was Hobbesian, poor, nasty, brutish, and nihilistic. The people had good reason to be scared and angry. They felt betrayed, and they wanted to destroy something. It was a bleak picture, but it was convincing, disturbingly so, especially as I considered it in the years after Trump's election. But it wasn't until I made another connection, this time to the late crumbling of the Roman Republic, that the antitrust piece really clicked in place. While it can be dangerous to draw too many parallels with other historical moments, it's surprising just how many parallels there are with our political moment and the collapse of the Roman Republic. Certainly one of the most studied and commented upon periods in human history, the general consensus about the collapse of Rome's republican institutions locates its source in a concentration of power in the hands of the Roman aristocracy, power consolidated by means of and for the purpose of wealth. As the political processes in Rome became increasingly subverted by the interests of those with more power because of their money, the political process itself became increasingly defined by the purpose of serving money. In Rome, it would take a little more than a full century for this erosion to lead to the crisis that produced Julius Caesar and the final resolution of these tensions in favor of autocracy in the figure of Augustus and the following Pax Romana. Autocracy is a solution because it proved to be the only meaningful check against the interests of a fully empowered aristocratic class. In order to grasp fully the implication of the analogy I'm drawing, a substitution is required. Instead of seeing today's billionaires in place of the Roman aristocracy, substitute corporate concern or shareholder value. Recognize that the corporate order has arrogated so much power to itself in the last half century, so fully reframed the terms of our politics, reshaped policy and legislation in its favor, and to legitimize this process, reshape discourse about what constitutes the public good. Indeed, that shareholder rights could somehow be seen as having equal claims on our national life as our civic health is a measure of the transformation that I'm talking about. And it's in this regard that the shift in antitrust thinking in the wake of Robert Bork is pivotal. Protecting the consumer's right to the lowest price as a first principle has operated as the legitimizing discourse of the takeover of the political process by big and bigger business. In other words, our political order, by which I don't just mean the legislative order, is increasingly defined by corporate thinking and corporate interests, our politics increasingly reflecting our Republican ideals less and less. Accepting the analogy with Rome can help us see that we might actually be moving into the final stage of the very conflicts that will resolve our political tensions, and perhaps, in our case too, in favor of the autocratic solution. It turns out Augustus was only able to succeed once he came to understand that aping the language and the outward forms of the republic was critical to the success of the dictatorship. In this insight is another helpful hint, and I translate. As the Roman autocracy had to pretend to be something other than what it was in order to succeed, similarly, our discussion about the benefits to the consumer, while appearing to minister to the needs of the demos, is actually a long-term play to consolidate power in favor of shareholders. Thank you, I think. In closing, I'd like to take a moment to commend so many of you gathered here in this room who are fighting a difficult and necessary fight. In my humble opinion, and I'm just an artist, there is no more important fight, and I am not exaggerating when I say that I stand in awe of the perseverance without which what you do just would not happen. From the heart, I want to thank you for the extraordinary work and dedication, and I want to thank Barry and Open Markets for the invitation. It's been an honor. Thank you.